Hello. So I guess we'll have GSoC updates. Vrushali or Raj, who wants to go first?
Okay, I will go first.
Okay.
Last time I was getting lots of error in Unity project, so I resolved that and wrote some code for movement of Morris watermails. It's not done yet, so I'm not showing you right now, but maybe within 2 days it will be showable. Plus working on animation and writing the names from text mesh pro. That's the update.
All right.
And actually I also did integration from something I don't remember actually, but yeah, where headset VR headset kind of controller I can incorporate on scene. So it will be fine for me to analyze how it will work on VR. So that's the thing.
All right. That sounds good. So you're working on the Morris Water Maze, getting things more developed there. What was the issue resolved again?
Scene was not loading, plus the animation, whatever UI I did, it was not loading also. Plus the what I should say, the data from participant I showed last few weeks ago, I did integrated in Excel sheet. So I like trying to do and extract the participants' information.
All right. All right. That sounds good. Yeah. So you say that there's something to show maybe later, maybe next week sometime.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will show.
All right. Sounds great. What are you going to do for this coming week? What are your objectives?
Like I will complete my pending work and showcase whatever like done this week and previous week, like next week. So like I'm not committing something more, but like completing the pending work I have.
Okay.
Plus I applied for lightning talk. I received the email from GSoC past few days ago, so I thought it would be great opportunity to showcase our work of virtual reality and plus our organization. So planning to do that also.
Oh yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, congratulations. Yeah, they have their they have GSoC, the program wide. They have like a seminar or something at the end of the term, at the end of the summer,
Yeah.
and they invite people to give a talk. I gave one last year on some of the GSoC stuff. Yeah.
Will you guide me in this process? Like whatever the things should be done, plus the it is necessary to make PPT to showcase the work. Anything kind of whatever the requirements we have there to like to make it good for public to understand our project. So please guide me.
Yeah, that would be good. I can help you with that. Just make sure that like everything is there. We want to do. And,
Yeah.
if you could, well, you'd want to come up with like a draft presentation. So just put in like what you think we should talk about, and then I'll help you kind of revise and refine it.
Yeah.
Because it's like some things that we can provide some information that you don't have, and then how this fits into a larger scheme. But you definitely want to have some of your stuff in there, and then we'll talk more about some of the organizational stuff, and maybe something on your experience with the organization. I think would be good for your talk, because it's like you're coming into an organization and you're experiencing it, and it's your first GSoC. Some people have had multiple GSoCs, or done them in multiple
Yes.
organizations. So just, in that sense, you can talk about your experience in the org, and then we can give you some information about the org and the roadmap and things like that. So that would be good. I think that'd be a good talk for you to give.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, that's great. Yeah, I look forward to seeing your work. Next week, your demos, or if you want to share them beforehand, we can take a look in the Slack.
Yeah, if it completed before the next meeting, I will post in the Slack channel or like show next meeting
Okay,
if possible.
sounds good. Yeah, thanks for the update. Raj, how are you?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
No. Okay, so 1 second, I'll just share my screen.
All right.
Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah, so this week I tried refactoring the website a bit, and I added this. So once you have logged in with your GitHub account, this is the list of the repositories of the user, and just if it's a forked repo or it's not a forked repo. And then this is the pagination. So I added this column to display what all languages a current repository has. But the issue with that, there was one slight issue is, let's say I take this ACE the front end as a sample issue, as a sample repository in my account. So this has 3 languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But for some reason, it's just taking the first one. So I'll try to figure out how to render the other languages as well from the GitHub REST API. So that is one thing. And second thing is I also incorporated the models into the website. So let's say if you click on the first repository itself, then this will take you to a page where there is a model. This is just a sample model as of now. I just wanted to test if it can be integrated with this. So if you click on any repository, you will get the model for that. The work that is remaining to do is currently I'm just able to retrieve these information from the for a particular repository. What I'll be trying right now this week is if suppose let's say I have this ACE the front end issue, ACE the front end repository. So I need the number of issues, pull requests, and everything for this particular repository, so that when I click on this repository, the data of this repository can be fed into the model. I'm not sure how that can be achieved, but I'll try thinking about it this week.
Okay.
And apart from that, I looked into the Q learning for reinforcement learning. So this is the equation which they are saying is what makes Q learning efficient. So this is just like ST and AT are just the current state and action values. These are the current values we have right now. This is the learning rate. This is the discount factor. So actually, what I was thinking is this discount factor. What it does is, let's say that this is the future reward, like the maximum reward we can obtain in the future. So what this discount rate is doing is, let's say I give the discount rate as 0.5. So basically, what will happen is whatever reward I'm obtaining in the future, that will be half. That will be, we are just taking the half of it because I'm adding a 0.5 in the beginning. So what this model will do is, this will not give weightage to the future rewards, rather it will give weightage to the immediate rewards, because the discount factor is 0.5. But let's say if I keep the discount factor as 0.97, 0.97, or even if I keep the discount factor as 1, it means that we need to focus on the future reward as well. So I need to see how that can be incorporated into designing the problem for open source sustainability. And then there is one model which I saw in the OpenAI Gymnasium to explain this. So let's say, I'm sorry. So if let's say this is a mountain sort of thing, and you have a car over, you have a car over here. So what this car has to do is, we have to reach up till this point. Let's say we have to reach this flag, and we have 4 options. Either we can go in these 4 directions. So what this will do is, if suppose let's say I go backwards here, So if I go backwards here, I'm moving away from my destination. So this is not the step we have to do. So we have to go frontward, and then we will keep on going like this. And then here I have to go downwards instead of right side. So what will happen is this will go around, let's say, for n iterations. And for every iteration, there is this table which is updated. So let's say that I am at this position. So what it will do is it will see if I take this step, what will be the reward? If I take this step, what will be the reward? If I take this step and if I take this step. So what happens is when this is trained for multiple iterations, at a point the table is quite accurate and precise to decide how our future actions should be. So I'll also try to see how this can be incorporated into modeling the problem for open source sustainability. The one problem which I faced is there is a library called OpenAI Gym something that is used for reinforcement learning. I had some issues configuring its installation, and I figured out it requires some older Python version, and I got stuck in that error for a while. So I'll try fixing that as well. And apart from that, I also worked on the documentation for the project. I'll share it in the chat. Just a second.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So I've shared the documentation. It's almost complete. I think there are some few things which have to be added. I'll complete that also in this.
Yeah, this looks great. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks. So that's a lot of work for 1 week. Yeah, it's good. What are your plans for this coming week? What do you want to follow up on?
I would like to see how this Q learning and all this thing can be applied to reinforcement learning, because in reinforcement learning we need to this has to be treated like a game. Like if a contributor reaches this stage, then it is considered as a win or as a profit, as a loss. So I'll try to define the problem of open source sustainability as a mathematical problem, so that reinforcement learning can be applied on it. I haven't thought about it much, so I'll try doing that this week. And once that is done, and as I told about this, 1 second, I'll share my screen. Yeah, as I told about this discount factor thing, which will see if we need the future award or not. I was thinking that this discount factor variable, this can be utilized in judging the contributor retention, because we can see that if I wish to determine if he will stay for a while or not, then I think this value can be adjusted accordingly. I need to get more deep into this to check that, but these are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this is interesting. We were talking about this a couple weeks ago, actually, about how to sort of fit, say, a reinforcement learning model better to the problem. And so I don't think we've gone over a lot of practical examples of open source sustainability. Maybe I'll bring that next week, because we talked about that last year, and it was, I think, helpful to see what kinds of problems you have with sustainability. So, but this is, I think going through the equation is good too, because, you need to map things to the equation to get it to work. So like if you have like variables, you can kind of create, okay, this is what this is basically about. And, I mean, you have a sense, I think a general sense of what kinds of problems you can address with this optimization equation. So you're trying to optimize for something. So, that you want to have it be, kind of a general model. So if I have like a specific example of like, I want to increase the number of GitHub contributions, or I want to increase activity on Slack or something, I can fit it into the same model and optimize it in a similar way. Otherwise, you're going to have people are going to wonder what kind of model they can use. And then it's going to be kind of confusing to people which model to use for what. And so some of that will get sussed out during like benchmarking and things, that you'll see that like some problems are better with some methods than others just because of their structure. But I think what you're doing going through the key learning equation is to try to figure out how that process is mapped. So what are you doing to, what are you trying to achieve? What's the optimization process and so forth. So I think that's really good. Yeah, and then I like the documentation, which I'll talk about more later, about how to do documentation and some tips. Yeah, we talked about OpenAI Gym last year too. We never really did much with it. I think Himanshu was working on it a little bit, but it wasn't really. He didn't get very far on it. So that's something. Yeah. That if you could get that up and running, it would be kind of interesting to see. And you might talk to Himanshu about that as well if he has like thoughts about it, because I don't think he got too far on it. But it's like one of those things. It's you can run it and you can get it running, but then you have to figure out how to use it, and that's a little harder because it's got a lot of moving parts. And then
even I was planning on consulting Himanshu once before using it.
Okay, yeah, and then so I mean, I don't know, so that's great. I think that's great just to see where we can go with these things. If if it's a success, like if OpenAI Gym is useful, then that's great. You can keep pushing on that. Yeah, so I definitely would follow up on all these things. I think the website. So the website, I know we had talked about using pseudo data or something like that. So where are we with that, and what are those orgs that you have listed?
I haven't looked into the pseudo data part much because I think that will come later once the model is developed. So right now I'm just looking into the reinforcement learning aspect of it.
Okay, but the orgs that you had in there were just populated from what?
From the GitHub API.
Oh, okay. So it's just an example. Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't know what I was looking at.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's good. Thank you for the update. Just I guess next week just keep going on some things and some of those things, and it's good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jesse, how are you?
The biggest thing on my mind is about I sort of reviewed someone's dissertation this week, and it was an interesting process of doing that. And I'm not going to really draw too much from that here, but yeah, I guess I'll just review this board and not to pull it up on the other thing here. So I think you can see this here now. So yeah, I know I kind of missed a little bit of what happened earlier today, but I guess has there been any updates on adding to any of the readmes? And those were things that we were mentioning before.
Yeah, I think Raj was showing some of his documentation that he was working on. So the documentation for this open source sustainability is in progress, but it's being worked on. And then Vrushali has addressed some of the things. So the Morris water maze is in progress. That's being worked on. So let's see. How do we want to go through the board? We'll go through from to do to the right. So the VR project, uploading UI assets to GitHub. I think Vrushali's working on that, so that's actually probably in progress. She's working on debugging some of those, so it's kind of like in the process of getting done.
Okay. And I guess the Morris water maze is kind of a subcomponent of all of that stuff.
Yeah, I guess she's working on Morris water maze as well. And it's like that's a long term. It's almost one of those things where we kind of put it in progress and we don't say how much we don't. I mean, it's hard to estimate how much you have in there, but it's. I think it's all in progress. She said that she might have some things to review by the end of the week on that. Now, for review, I guess we can just put those in. Maybe we can put one in for review now and just say review assets and then assign it to Vrushali, and then when we have assets to review, we can make comments on that.
Yeah, I think some of these are like long-term things. Some are very specific tasks.
Yeah.
So I'm a little. If this was a different thing, I might emphasize trying to clean it up a bit more to be a little more structured. But I don't think anybody's really actively using this, so I'm not going to fuss that much. I guess the demo is sort of. Is that still a thing, or is that happening anymore?
Why don't we take that and like divide it into? So Raj just gave an update on his RL exploration. So maybe we can say like, instead of an RL demo, we have this Q learning, almost like a Q learning analysis or Q learning demo, which is where he's taking Q learning and trying to figure out how to map it to open source sustainability problems. Well, there's no presentation, it's just kind of like an update, but that's the direction that it's going in.
Okay. Is this more of a, just for my sake, is this a specific feature of the project that we're trying to hit for sure? Or is it a, let's explore this as we're going along the way optional thing?
Well, I mean, we talked about last couple weeks about learning about reinforcement learning, and that was a pretty general thing. And I think Raja settled in on this idea of taking the Q-learning algorithm, or the Q-learning equation, rather, and like analyzing it so that we can map it better to some of the models. Because he's working on the models and kind of focusing in on how Q-learning works, or how reinforcement learning works in these models. And so this is, I think, probably the core thing to sort of focus on from, learning about reinforcement learning. So the reinforcement learning demo maybe is something that comes down the road. Like, if he improves upon the model that Himanshu made last year, that would be like the demo, the final demo of that. But even if you have like an equation and knowing how it maps to the problems, that's also kind of a reinforcement learning demo. So
yeah. So, and I have an idea about something I might do on this board, just because for my own sake, and just to be a little bit more like project managery about it. I'm thinking of basically making right now, like basically a macro for each project, basically making like a macro, like these are kind of individual tasks and then also not, and like the scoping of the phrasing of some of these is a little different and kind of nebulous. And I'm considering making like an actual, let me show this here. Like an issue that actually summarizes all these different parts, and that we can look at that a little more clearly.
yeah.
I don't know if that's something. Are you okay with that, Bradley? Or
Oh yeah, I think that's good.
Because I
yeah.
if we're gonna use the board at all, like let's actually use it in like a somewhat real way as opposed to
Yeah. Well, I've been like, doing this project management teaching, where I'm trying to teach people how to make like the optimal size of an issue. So like, is it like the number of words that you use, or is it like the concept, or what makes like an optimal issue size? Sometimes, issues can be like really broad or really narrow, and it's hard to know like how they fit together. So this is kind of like we're fitting in a bunch of things under this macro issue. I like this idea.
Yeah, and like I would even as I'll just make this now and have this be assigned to like Vrushali, but like when I see this, and I'll make it here so I can actually look at it. Because there's even things like, and we could go to Zen Hub, but like you could call it like milestones, or what they call like epics, or like whatever. There's all these different like project management names for this stuff. But I'll just put these here in terms of like where did it go? Here. Okay. Yeah. And I may even like just combine this later, but just for the sake of right now, can I pull this out? Sorry, I don't know why this is yeah, what happened on my screen? Okay. So I had an issue on my computer there for a second. Okay. So when I look at this, I feel like, okay, what do we actually have here? Whoa. We have like, I'm trying to break down what these are. Like, update to README is sort of documentation. The Morris Water Maze, is that like the project itself, or is that part of the project? Is that like a subcomponent, or is that like the project title is Morris Water Maze?
No, it's part of the project. So I think Vrushali's building like a lab, a virtual lab, and that's part of the virtual lab. There are other parts. The Morris Water Maze is the one she's working on, you know, in most detail right now. So yeah, I guess enhancements would be good. Components. And so yeah, 23, 36, 37. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess the thing is like, what's a little different about this is that I'm not really sure what like end targets, like what, these are all things that are sort of happening. Is there anything on this page, or should there be a new, there's a way to do it here where you can just make one, I forget what it is. Is there anything that's like, I don't want to say end goals, like is there any target that, a lot of this right now is sort of let's develop and see how far we get, right, and then that'll be it. Is there any targets we're actually aiming for specifically on this? Let's say the same thing just for the Vrushali project right now. Like,
well, I mean, the end goal would be like, the immediate end goal would be submitting the project, because we don't, I mean, you know, we want to build something that we can expand later. It's basically getting these pieces into place, and then, you know, maybe the documentation as well, which we have a documentation issue, but it's not like for both people. So it's, right now there's like August update documentation, but yeah, there's a submission to Google, which we should probably put in the board as like, I think the deadline is October 23rd or October 30. I can't remember what it is. I think the project is submitted, I think, by the 23rd, but I can't remember the exact date. But that would be, maybe we should make an issue for both Raja and Vrushali on that. At the 23rd, good. So yeah, just make like an issue where it's like, and then that'll be like an end point, and then, you know, the other endpoint would be finishing up the issues, making sure they're all sort of done. And I think we're still kind of deciding which ones are going to come to completion and which ones aren't. But if we don't, you know, if we have an issue that we can't resolve by the 23rd of October, then it's just not resolved, and it's not in that submission. So, yeah.
Okay. There used to be a way to do a due date on this specifically. At any rate, you can do it here. 2 months away.
Yeah.
1 month.
Yeah, it was a little
All
over
right.
2 months.
So yeah. That's 40. Yeah, and I feel like I know this is a bit just fussing about stuff, but I'm doing this for the sake of part of doing some work like this is doing some of the project management work to show other people, like in real jobs, you'll probably be using like Jira. You'll be using these other things that are taking track of individual tasks that need attention. And okay, we need to move this forward. We need to enhance this animation. We need to add this part to the demo, and there'll be much more details in this. But I feel like this is at least a way to think about it for the time being as what to structure what we're doing here. Okay, that's fine. And also, like, I really encourage Vrushali and Raj to go to this and put in here, like for this one, go to this ticket or go to this issue, which is, here we go. Whoops. Go to this issue and add the things you want to accomplish and the things you're working on yourself, because I'm not you, and I'm just sort of doing this. Believe it or not, I'm not you. So,
Yeah. Well, it looks like we have one for the VR project, so Raj would have to build his own based on that template. So that would be like some of the other things. Yeah, an open source sustainability README, RL demo, and those are all kind of in different stages of completion too. So
yeah, I'll make the other one if as we talk about stuff, we don't have to watch me do it here.
Right.
Combine it into a macro issue and add that. Outside of things to talk about, if you want to dive into documentation, maybe it's a good segue to do that. I may say a little bit something later, but like it's not that important. Also, it's already, we only have 20 minutes left anyway, so maybe not.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can.
All right. Yeah. So thanks for the update on the board. So yeah, we'll use those macro issues. I like that idea. It's always a challenge to sort of encapsulate what you're trying to do, the right-sized issue, and sometimes it's easy because it's just like, a very rote menial task, like, where it's a very general task, like explore the literature. But then you get down to like these between the rote tasks and the big overarching tasks, you really have to figure out what it is that you're trying to do. And that's why we have these tasks on the task board in the first place. So we can like say, I want to do this thing in this amount of time. And then I can either say, I can give it a status. I can then say whether I'm done. I can say what the percentage of it that I've done. So like when we make an estimate, a percentage, a lot of times it's just kind of an estimate we pull out of thin air. We don't really know how much is done. I say it's like 70% done, and then I like find out that there's more to do. So I'm like, well, it's 40% done. It's kind of like when you ask someone, how far along are you in your dissertation, and that's like because it's always like in flux until you have it done, and so you never know how much you have done. But that's the thing. If we have better terms, and this is a semantic issue. If we have better terms, we can or better ways that we state something, then we can complete it more, successfully in this kind of format where we put things on a board and we move them around to different statuses. So that's just my take on that. I'm going to talk right now about documentation and some of the sort of tips that you might find useful when you're preparing documentation. So Raj has been working on documentation, Vrushali as well, a little bit, but I want to make sure that we go over some of these tips. So actually, the first thing I want to talk about is this article from opensource.com. This is It's an article called 5 Tips for Making Documentation a Priority in Open Source Projects. So, in a lot of open source projects, people talk about doing, doing code or code contributions, and those are all great. You want to maybe update a piece of code or, fix a piece of code, fix bugs. Those are all important things. But documentation is also important. And depending on, the culture of the open source project, sometimes documentation is as important as code, and sometimes it's just kind of an afterthought, just kind of a minimal thing that you do to make sure that people don't get totally lost. Now, there are different types of project management. There's the waterfall approach, which is an older approach where documentation is so important that it's basically the specs for everything you do subsequent to that. So you'll do you'll have documentation for everything that you do, and you'll specify everything before it gets done. So that's great for things like reproducibility, for making sure that things work the way they're supposed to. But sometimes it's not, because sometimes people are using the software in different types of machines or different types of use cases, and so in that sense, having more documentation or having documentation be on parity with code is maybe not the greatest idea, because you're just wasting time building documentation for scenarios that don't exist, or you're trying to enforce standards that aren't necessarily enforceable on your project. In agile management, which is a newer type of management, its focuses on speed and rapid development. And so documentation is more of an afterthought in those cases, where you write code and then you document it afterwards. And so in that kind of case, you can move faster, your documentation may be more relevant, but you do miss out on the deep description of what your code is doing, what kinds of specs or standards you might want to impose and so forth. So it's a trade-off. But in this article, they talk about how open source software is mainstream, and so people need to understand the role of documentation in this paradigm. And so different organizations have different cultures to how they deal with documentation. There are some challenges with documentation in open source. Although everyone agrees it's important and it needs to be done, sometimes it doesn't get done. Sometimes it's deprioritized. Sometimes it's over-prioritized in the examples that I just gave. And so, sometimes it's prioritized, but the quality is poor because you don't really devote a lot of resources to it. So sometimes you can have poor quality and lack of consistency that defines documentations in a project. And that's because you thought it was important, but it wasn't done well. So you just kind of say it's important to have documentation. And then you kind of put together maybe like a very simple description of things that are maybe at too high a level of abstraction for people to really get anything out of. For example, you just give like a description of the thing, or you give limited instructions on how to use it, and people really can't get very much out of it. Sometimes documentation is done by volunteers or people who have a hard time saying no, which means that they're not trained in how to make documentation. They don't know anything about technical writing, which is a skill that you can use to write documentation. Or people who want to do it but they don't have the time. And so sometimes if you don't have the time, you kind of cut corners, and that can be bad. People may forget about documentation after the release, so maybe they don't make updates to the documentation. So when you have a documentation priority in your organization, you really have to have a strategy for seeing it through. And so that could be making sure that at every version update, documentation is also updated. Or it could be that you have a really good deep coverage of your documentation, meaning that it really covers the project well, the project code. It describes everything. It gives it detailed instructions, but it's never updated. And so in that sense, it's worthless because it doesn't match the current version. So this group has been involved in documentation in the Linux Foundation, in GitLab. They're sharing five best practices here. So the first one are that you value contributions to documentation just as much as code contributions. So this is part of the culture of the organization that is encouraged. So one easy way to make sure documentation contributions are valued by everyone is to give equal credit to documentation and code in your community metrics. So this is relevant to what Raj is trying to do in the open source sustainability project, where, one of the things you need if you want to understand community sustainability is you need a metric. You need to understand what you need to measure something. You need to understand what you're measuring in the community. And so what sometimes organizations will do is have metrics for understanding contributions, the scale of contributions, the number or the level of contributions. But of course, people can play to contributions. They can play to like statistics and say, I made like 20 contributions, and they could be, all sort of bug fixes versus like actually building things. And so those aren't very good metrics because they don't differentiate. Sometimes people will say, well, documentation isn't well valued, so I should rather contribute code instead of documentation. And so, having metrics that you can maybe show on a dashboard or that people can understand, in terms of like how much sort of credibility or prestige there is in some task, like making documentation or writing code or doing bug fixes. Those are all important. So this is one way to enforce sustainability, is to say, we'll give you credit for documentation the same as code. And so this is something that a lot of organizations should do. They don't always do it. It should not matter whether a commit, merge request, or pull request is for code or documentation. So when I receive a pull request, that's a statistic that says I got a pull request. Sometimes organizations will maybe credit a code pull request, give it a higher sort of priority than a documentation pull request. So they'll split that metric into two parts. They'll say, I have a bunch of pull requests that I'm getting. I'm getting more code-related pull requests versus documentation-related pull requests. And there's this sort of implication that code is more important. But of course, documentation is just as important for sustainability. So in this case, your community metric is basically that you're counting code contributions and holding them in more esteem. So in addition, when you do community recognition, include key accomplishments by people who contribute to documentation. So these metrics that we use, the way that they get translated into sustainability isn't just that they get counted in the same way, but they also get recognized in the same way. So you take the number of pull requests that you have maybe per month, and you'll plug that into like a newsletter where you do community recognition. And you say, here are the people who've contributed things into the organization. And you recognize people, but you don't just recognize maybe the code contributors or the profile and then say, oh, these other people did this documentation. It's more of a qualitative thing in that sense, where you're separating out people. And this is, where sort of you get these metrics, you also get this qualitative aspect of sustainability, and it comes together in a way that affects the organization. The second point is put documentation and code in the same project repo. So again, this is something that you can do that it affects the structure of the project long term by making the structure short term be friendly to documentation. So and the reason you want to do that is to get people in the mindset of treating it with parity. So the third one is make documentation a requirement for a merge or release milestone. So this is another way to enforce sustainability through this metric where you say, if you want to make a pull request, you have to add documentation in at a certain level. And you might give a template for it so that people can easily meet that requirement. The problem with this, of course, is that as you up the requirements, as you up the bar for sort of making a pull request, you'll maybe get fewer pull requests because people don't want to bother with documentation. So they may not actually make the contribution at all. But this is something, if you're making a release, then that's maybe a good requirement to have. It's just on the checklist, so it gets done, and that will keep the community sustainable because you'll have that piece in place. Number 4 is have a consistent contribution process for code and documentation. So this is where you use, a standard set of tools. You have a standard set of templates. You have a standard thing that doesn't require people to do a lot of work. If they're just making a pull request and they need documentation, they don't have to start from scratch. If you're working in a project, maybe you make your own templates or you make your own sort of documentation with a structure that people can add to later. So it's, there are different ways to do this to make it easier for people to actually make the contribution. And then 5 is have well-documented processes for contributing to documentation. So again, this is where we have these templates or these easy sort of affordances or hooks where people can just plug in their documentation. They can plug in their description or their process, and it's easy to do. So you don't have to worry about spending a lot of effort on that thing. So that's these are the 5 sort of tips. Now, there is this idea of best practices, which I mentioned, and this is an article from Style Guide. This is from I think Google Style Guide. So this is from Google, sort of their open source efforts, and this is their documentation best practices. So this is from the Elements of Programming Style, which is Brian Kernighan, I think, is involved in that. Or this is actually a quote, say what you mean simply and directly. So this is actually a quote from Brian Kernighan from the Elements of Programming Style. And just basically that's the principle that you're operating on for best practices here in documentation. You don't need to you don't need to write a novel. You don't need to build an architecture on top of the architecture that you've already built. You just need to describe what you mean simply and directly. So there's this concept of minimal viable documentation. And that's that's defined as a small set of fresh and accurate docs, which means that fresh means that they're updated regularly, and accurate means that they're accurate with respect to the recent release. These kinds of docs are better than a sprawling, loose assembly of docs in various states of disrepair. So when you have a bunch of docs that are you write a huge number of docs at the beginning of your project, and you have these high expectations, it's very specified, but then as time goes on, they become out of sync with this code, and so in that sense, they're useless. And they should be organized very tightly around one another, so they should all be hyperlinked, or they should be in the same document with a good outline. Then the next tip is write short and useful documents. Cut out everything unnecessary, while also making a habit of continuing, massaging, and improving every doc to suit your changing needs. So it's not just updating it with factual information. It's updating the outline with, maybe if you find that it's hard for someone to figure out what you mean in this part of the documentation, you change that part of the documentation to make it more user-friendly. And sometimes that requires feedback from contributors. Sometimes it's just rereading the documentation and saying, I could have done a better job there to describe it. So sometimes, going through and refactoring documentation is a good practice. And because you'll catch things. And in any type of writing, this is true. You write something out, you think it's great, and then you put it away for a while and you come back to it and you read it. And when you read through it again, you find a lot of cruft and other types of errors that didn't appear to be the case at the time. So identify what you really need what are the things that are essential to the thing that you're writing documentation on? What are the essential pieces? So maybe you have a release doc, an API doc, and maybe some testing guidelines, and that might be enough. Then you just cut all the stuff that you don't need, and you revise it as needed, you review it as needed, and so forth. Updating docs with code, so that means that every time there's a code release or maybe a major code update, you go through the docs just as well as you go through the code. Delete dead documentation. So if you have documentation for a previous version, maybe something you don't support anymore, or maybe there were some part of the software that got deleted, you got rid of some features, old features, you delete those documentation references as well. So you don't want to have like dead stuff in your documentation. You don't want to have things that were there before, but now they're not. So this is something that, again, reviewing it on a regular basis, figuring out what's unclear, and then making sure that everyone knows what's a live issue and what's a dead issue in the documentation is good. Default to delete or leave behind if migrating. Stragglers can always be recovered. So the benefit of doing this in version control is that you can modify, you can cut things out, you can delete things and make them like very tight, at least the version that you have live in GitHub, but you also have previous versions that you can revert to if you need to. So if you make a mistake when you delete something or you need it later, you have those previous versions available. Then there are 2 points here. Prefer the good over the perfect, which means you prefer like something that's good and functional over a perfect document. So don't worry about making it perfect, just make it good and straightforward. And then documentation is the story of your code. So, documentation doesn't need to be like really complex. It just needs to be like a narrative of your code or something that describes your code in a way that's not code. So it gives a human, like it allows a human to think about what the code's doing, how will you do something with the code, and so forth. So these are all nice guidelines, and then maybe you'll find them useful. The third one I want to talk about is the anatomy of a great open source documentation, how to document your projects on GitHub. So this article talks about some of these aspects of documentation. They really kind of go through a lot of the things we've already talked about, but they kind of talk about how you might structure this. So you have a README file, which is like the storefront of the project. It's sort of like how you access the project outside of just pawing through the code or sifting through the code. You just basically make it clear how to execute the code or what's in the repository. You may add a license if necessary. Of course, it's usually necessary. And then you run an inventory of all the things that are there. Then there are things like reference files and guide files and cookbook files. So reference files are sort of, it allows you to properly document how functions work. It allows you to sort of state your main goals and show examples of use cases. The guide file takes the user by the hand and guides them through all the features of the software. So it sort of serves as like not a cookbook, that's usually the cookbook file, but it's a guide to sort of going through the code and how some of these things work. So you tie it in with maybe the commenting that you do in the code, where you comment things, you say, this is what this piece of code does. This guide file is a little bit higher level than that. It kind of gives you this sort of general purpose library of things. It allows you to sort of walk through the code and really kind of describes what it's supposed to be doing, how it relates to the goal of the project and so forth. Then there's the cookbook file, which is where you might give recipes for doing different things for different use cases. So give examples of how you might implement this. Give like different sort of pieces of code that might, maybe like a hello world example, or maybe like how you can do something that a lot of people want to do with the code. So these self-contained recipes might describe how to use different libraries to accomplish specific tasks. You might, and one example might be where you take a bunch of input data and you parse the input data into strings. That's something a lot of people are interested in doing in some cases. So you might include a sample program for that. Make it very easy for people to get started. And then finally, the blog post, which ties all this documentation together and puts a face on it for the public, so that when you can advertise what you've done, but you can also say, okay, you can read more here. But this is basically what we're trying to do in this project. Why was this needed? Why was this program needed in the first place? What was the context of it, or your motivation for starting and working on this project? What problems does the software solve? Why does this particular library, and they're referencing a library, which is their project, but that particular library over other similar options. So you try to sell your project as this solution to a problem, a motivation to maybe something in the world, and then why people should pay attention to it. And then they can go to the documentation and learn more, sometimes very specific things, sometimes just what's available and how it can be configured. So these are all things that you want to do. And this finally leads us into this document management system. So document management systems are good for not just for documentation, but for sort of organizing files and documents. So I've stressed GitHub in the organization a lot, but there are these document management systems that allow you to track the history of different versions, different changes. So document management systems really are sort of like, GitHub does this, but it does it under the hood. So you don't necessarily get you don't see a lot of this going on. But basically it allows you to manage versions. It allows you to manage documents and files. And then, this is sort of the history and the components. So you have things like metadata, document management integration. And so these are things you can use for documentation, retrieval, storage, distribution. These are things you can use for documentation to get these things in the hands of the users or the contributors that you need to. And so there are a lot of things you may need, like metadata standards, or capture standards if you're bringing data into your program, or other types of things. If you're storing data, if you're storing documents, you need to have processes for those. So in workflow, so you may need to incorporate workflow into your documentation and match it with the workflow that you're doing in your organization. So these are all things that this kind of a document management system helps you. Some of this is done in GitHub, but not all of it. There are formal document management systems you can use as well, above and beyond GitHub. So those are that's documentation is sort of the very broad view, and I wanted to go over that. I think that'll help. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming maybe at first. I'll put these in the links to these documents in the Slack, but I think it helps you think about like what are, not only for the projects you're doing here, but as you move on in your careers, how to leverage documentation to make your projects a lot better and usable. Okay. So yeah, we're at the end of the period. So any other questions before we go? Comments?
Nothing major. I would just say think about I won't rehash anything that's been said. Just please use Slack and GitHub for updates, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good week.